Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den. And today I think is going to be the penultimate video of my RPG journey. I'm going to talk about 3rd edition. And I'm going to talk about the OSR, old school Renaissance, old school revival, old school rules, whatever it's supposed to stand for. I don't think anybody ever knew. I don't really have any props for 3rd edition because, and by props I mean books, because I kind of got rid of all of them finally. The last few games that I've played have used either my own rules or they cook. I have 1st edition AD&D, I have 2nd edition AD&D. I just didn't need the 3rd edition books. So I'm not going to be displaying them here. But I am going to be talking about them because even though my favorite, Dungeons and Dragons rules are Moldvay Cook and Advanced, my longest campaigns that I played were with 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. So a little history. When my 2nd edition AD&D game finally broke up, I kind of stowed everything away and actually got rid of quite a few things because I thought I was probably done with Dungeons and Dragons, and I was out of it for a pretty long time. And a real good friend of mine one day mentioned they were getting a group together because there was a new edition of Dungeons and Dragons, 3rd edition. Would I like to play? Yeah, why not? It was a group of friends, so I might as well. It'd be fun. So I went over to somebody's house. We were doing character roll-up and generation. There's your first clue, though, of how things are changing, is that you got to spend like a whole session doing that, whereas, Moldvay Cook, you can roll a character up in a few minutes if you know what you're doing. So, just a few things initially kind of stuck out to me with those books. Number one, I hated the covers. I've always hated those covers, and I probably always will. I do not like those covers. I like covers with art on them. I did not like those covers. Okay, interior. A lot of good art. Todd Lockwood, friggin' amazing art. But it seemed overproduced to me. I like a clean white page with black type on it that had the backgrounds. That's kind of the way things are done, though, nowadays. Not a fan of it, but there it was. But these are not big deals. When you really go through 3rd edition rules, you could see, on the one hand, they were hearkening back to 1st edition in the classes, in the races. You got a monster manual with the demons and devils that are right there. So there is a throwback quality to 3rd edition. On the other hand, it's more rules heavy, better organized, but more rules heavy. At times it feels like an engineering project, like more science than art. I'll maybe put it that way. But not necessarily bad. It's well thought out and it's well structured. But I think in the long run, that actually hurt it a little bit, at least in terms of the way the people that I played with played the game. A lot of them had gotten their start with 2nd edition Advanced D&D. Some of them really didn't have any D&D experience at all. And just as 3rd edition is very mechanical, sometimes I found their play to be a little mechanical. When it's time for their character to do something, they're looking at the character sheet. What can I do? As opposed to, you could try anything. You may not succeed, but you could try anything. But that would come out in the play later. Initially, I was just rolling up a character. One thing that struck me was I managed to roll an 18 for one of my ability scores, and I was looking at it going, wow, if I was a dwarf, that would bump my con over 18, so I can't do that. And I mentioned that to somebody, and the person who is going to be dungeon mastering was like, no, you can do that. It's not against the rules. Well, you can have ability scores over 18? Okay. Well, I became a dwarf barbarian with a absolutely stupid number of hit points at first level. The character kind of became a little legendary in the campaign because of his ability to withstand damage. I sort of played him like the troll slayers in Warhammer, with kind of like a death wish, but also because it's fun to get everybody else in trouble by charging into things. And it was fun, but that was kind of different. Just the way, and the fact that a dwarf could be a barbarian, you could be almost anything. And it worked differently, but it didn't work badly necessarily. But it worked differently. Some things didn't work as well as they did in first edition. But on the whole, we had a pretty good time playing third edition. We did a fairly long campaign with my buddy running it, and it was pretty cool. And then we switched over to me running things, and then I pretty much became the go-to dungeon master for, golly, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years. Well, at one point I stepped aside, somebody else did it, but he was running the game in my campaign world. So I was a pseudo player, but I would help him with stuff. In essence, I knew all the secrets. I knew every secret of the campaign, but I played like I didn't, so that the other players could figure it all out. But that way I could help them, with sort of the background. Well, would this work in this area? Well, not really. What if you did this? I'd give them kind of tips on maybe how to get the other players into the game. So that's not hard to do if as long as you're honest, you can pretend you don't know things. And like I said, generally let the other players take the lead, and I'd sort of follow behind. But so I DM'd for quite a while with the game. We did change over to 3.5 at one point, which I think it solved some problems, but I think it also took a little bit of the sort of heart and soul that was in third edition. It kind of dialed that down a little bit. But I got heavily into it for a while as a dungeon master, buying all of the Splat books, and after a while there were some problems that were becoming obvious in the game. I kind of mentioned one being the players were a little more mechanical and a little less improvisational in their play. And I think that had something to do with those rules, with the skill system, etc. The sheer number of rules could be a problem at times because I knew them, and most of the players didn't. And there was a lot of back and forth of them asking me, well, how do I do this? Okay, well, it's like this. Okay. Or, am I supposed to add this together for this? Yes, add that in. Don't add that in. Oh, I forgot to add it in. Okay, let's go back around and try to, There were some issues with that where, I was already starting to feel not just nostalgic for the older editions, for the art, for the presentation, for the aesthetic, for the feel of them, but also for the far fewer rules, the far fewer bonuses and modifiers. Those games are more lo-fi, they're more minimalist, they run quicker. I was typically running a party in third edition of 6 to 8 people. Those combats, which people looked forward to, they could last an hour or so. And the biggest problem was the amount of wait time between your turn and your next turn. And it was difficult to keep people into the game while we messed around with a grid and miniatures, and I can move this far. Yeah, you can move. Okay, and then what's the rate? Oh. And I started thinking, you know what, man? Combat in the older editions was so much easier. And we had fun. Like, I'm not viewing this as an advancement, as a better experience. You know, it's a lot more work, and I don't feel like I'm getting any bang for all them bucks that I'm spending. And I also felt like that with the Splat books. It's just more sort of classes that are, you know, and more templates and more feats. And the feats themselves, you know, you have all these rules, and all the feats are just like a legal way to break different rules. But because you do it that way, the guy without the feat can't really do the thing that the feat, you know, lets you do. Whereas in an older edition, you could be coming up with crazy ideas, and the DM would just figure out a modifier on a combat dice, or just figure out some way to do it, or even hand wave it. The skills too. With all the skills there seemed to be a need to make a skill check all the time for everything. And I'm going, man, we just hand wave a lot of this stuff. But see, now the players, they've invested, you know, a lot of time into gaining those skills. So they want to use the skills. They don't want you to hand wave somebody who doesn't. Oh, yeah. So after a while, I was starting to become dissatisfied with the games and with the sessions. And I was telling them, look, we maybe need to change some stuff up. And some of it was my fault. Adding complexity because I thought maybe it'd make for a better game, wouldn't that be fun? And finding, no, it was a huge mistake. I needed a less complexity. And it was about this time that I think you got the first stirrings of what would become the sort of old school gaming movement. You had folks who were diehards who'd never given up the older editions. You had oldsters like me who were kind of, I think, going through the same thing I was and figuring out, are there ways we could kind of dial this back? You think about Dungeon Crawl Classics from Goodman Games, you know, which was like 3rd edition rules, 1st edition feel. That was in the air. That was happening. One of the first things that sort of, I think, launched the old school movement was OSRIC. The old school reference and index compilation. Well, what was OSRIC, really? Well, it's 1st edition of AD&D. It's almost like the rules cyclopedia version of 1st edition. It came from a website, and my golly, I can't remember the name of the website. I want to almost say it was like the Green Dragon Inn, but that might very well be wrong. But they were a group of gamers who had never given up on 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And they had a whole bunch of downloadable modules for it that people had made. And it was starting to become obvious to people that with the open game license, you could actually create material designed for older editions because it was largely backward compatible, and therefore actually, instead of just doing these as free downloads, you could actually sell them. The OGL very early on became a problem for Wizards of the Coast. The intent behind it was third parties can create adventures to support our products. There's a low profit margin on those. We don't want to do it. We'll let others do it. And we'll focus on campaign settings and splat books and extra rule books. That's where the money is. But the OGL doesn't restrict people from making those kinds of books. And people made them. And some of them were very good. In fact, were better, in my opinion, than what Wizards was doing. And some of them were awful. And they glutted the market. And so there was an early kind of a crash of the D&D market. And that hurt Wizards. And they clearly at this point wanted to get rid of the OGL. How do we get around the open gaming license? So I think when all that happened, that's when fourth edition became a twinkle in an executive's eye. The old school movement then kind of went a step further. Hey, we could create our own set of rules, and we can use terms like hit points and armor class, and we can use a lot of the monsters, maybe reskin a few that we're not allowed to, that are WOTC product identity, and we can recreate the old games. We could clone the old rules. Osric was kind of an advanced Dungeons and Dragons clone, but it was really designed just as a reference piece for people who wanted to do adventures using for first edition AD&D and be able to sell them. So it wasn't something that was necessarily intended as a rule book you would use at the table, but of course you could use it for exactly that. Now, around the same time as Osric, and maybe before it, one of my favorites came out, and this was my first foray into ditching the third edition rules. And this was Basic Fantasy by Chris Gonerman. And it's not exactly a clone, but it harkens back to Moldvay Cook, Basic Expert D&D. I actually think this is one of the absolute best things that ever came out of the movement, and it's really kind of pre-old school Renaissance. It's a little bit before it became a movement, and it was just sort of, here's a guy with a cool idea putting it together. This was a huge inspiration to me to producing my own stuff. I love it, and I would still run games with this. It's one of the things from that era that I actually kept. In terms of clones, well, hold on. I'll hold off on the clones because let's talk a little bit about what I think really created the OSR as a movement. And keep in mind, an unorganized movement, a movement with infighting, with disagreements, but a movement with a massive amount of creative energy. So, as I said, Wizards was at a certain point clearly wanting to get around the OGL. They wanted to bring D&D back fully in-house and maybe have more control. Maybe they would license third parties, but it's not going to be this free stuff anymore. But they got a problem. If we make a fourth edition and it's backward compatible with our earlier editions, people are going to be able to modify the OGL to work with our fourth edition game. So we've got to make a fourth edition that is not backward compatible for the most part with older editions of D&D. Okay, that's the only way to do it, but you can see that's going to create problems. Why do I want to play a game where I got material from the 70s through like up to, maybe early 2000s or so that is broadly compatible, and ditch all of that for this new edition? So there's some issues there, and I think to some degree, fourth edition was always going to be a sacrificial lamb for Wizards of the Coast for that very reason. But then Wizards marketing came in and screwed up large. When they decided to launch the announcement for what fourth edition was going to be, bear in mind, up until that point, they've been selling 3.5 books, 3.5 edition books, and they're not cheap. And they're telling us how awesome they are. They're hyping them. They're getting people excited for them. And they're doing this, and by the way, with editing standards that were starting to go downhill quick. But they're doing this knowing that they're about to launch a new edition that is going to make all of those books useless if you plan to play the current edition. So marketing gets this idea. To get people excited for the new edition, let's trash old school D&D. And they changed their website to make it essentially a mockery of first edition D&D and the other editions from that period. They mocked Errol Otis art, they mocked Dave Sutherland art, they mocked Dave Trampier art, they mocked Guy Gaxon and Arnesen's game. Those old editions always sucked. They were never good. Nobody ever had any fun. Forgetting for the fact that they sold vastly more copies than third edition ever did. Vastly more. Much bigger cultural impact than third edition ever had. Much bigger. They mocked and derided all of it, so all of us people that had played it for dozens and dozens and dozens of years, maybe that's too many dozens, but we'll just say dozens of years, we're going to suddenly go, that's right, I never had fun playing this game. I always hated it. Hey, corporation, give me your new edition. Thank you. Oh, there was backlash, and I think that backlash was the spark that turned a lot of this sort of nostalgia and desire for maybe more rules-lite systems into a movement with some passion behind it. And then we start getting more releases. We got Labyrinth Lord, which is your basic expert D&D. Swords and Wizardry, which is the one that I used a lot in my early publishing as my basis. And we also started getting really cool creative stuff. Petty gods. I had a god in this one. Let's see if we can find that. This was a crowd-sourced thing. People invented ideas for these very minor little deities that were kind of weird and kind of maybe a little Lovecrafty, maybe a little Clark Ashton Smith. Just something different. And then they got artists to illustrate all of them. There we go. What did I call? Yeah, that was my Tricrucia. She was the goddess of three-way forks in dungeon tunnels. Remember, the point was to go very obscure. Chris Huth did the art. So I got my little mark on that book. You got lots of stuff like this. Campaign settings. A lot of creativity came out and created the OSR. It's never been sort of an organized thing. There's people in there that despise one another. There's people now that don't even want to use the initials. I still have a fond memory of it. It launched me creating games. It launched a lot of products that I really loved and have held on to. I think overall it was a good thing. The other thing that Wizards did with 4th edition was essentially screw Paizo. Paizo had become the publisher of Dungeon and Dragon magazines. They started doing this idea of adventure paths. So over the course of a year, you'd have 12 parts of a big epic adventure. They wanted to work with 4th edition. They were waiting, but they had deadlines. And finally they said, we can't wait anymore. And they cloned 3.5 as Pathfinder. The end result was 4th edition did not take off that well, really. It's hard to get numbers, but it looks like Pathfinder outsold it. A lot of old school guys moved into the OSR and started playing all those games and just having a good time. OSR was kind of like, it was punk, it was outlaw country. You know, if there's any point to the OSR, people ask that. What is it? What is it all about? It's a big FU to the corporation that gave a big FU to us. And we're seeing that kind of energy now with comic books and the indie comic scene that's sort of trying to grow and not replace Marvel and DC, but just give artists a chance to produce what they want to produce themselves and just get away from the corporate nonsense. That's really what the OSR was. And like I said, it launched me getting to do my own products. And that's going to be the next and final installment of my role-playing game journey. I'm going to take a look at some of the stuff that I wrote over the years. Talk about how I came up with it and what was it all about. Look, I was never a major player when it came to this stuff. I didn't sell enough copies of anything for me to quit my job and become a game designer. But I had a hell of a lot of fun doing it. I learned how to commission art. I learned how to lay out books, and I think some of them came out pretty good. Some of the early efforts were a little crude, but I had a tremendous amount of fun, and they're still out there for sale, and I know there's people out there still play them and buy them. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart that you do. I really enjoy it. In fact, most of these toys that I've been collecting over the last couple of years, that's from my proceeds from those sales. I banked a lot of it. Now I'm maybe spending more of it than I should. I'm slowing it down. But at any rate, so third edition, overall, hey, it got me back into D&D, and it's not a bad game. It's a solid game. It's good rules. I got no problem with anybody who digs third edition or 3.5 or Pathfinder. But it is a little rules heavy for me, and ultimately I really like that more stripped down minimalist kind of punk feel of old school D&D, and that's why I ended up becoming, I guess you could call it, a member of the OSR, a participant in the OSR, whatever, dude. All right, so that'll do it for today. Hey, I know there's got to be some comments, right? I had to get some stuff wrong. I had to piss somebody off, at least with what I just said, probably. Throw those comments in there. I'm happy to chat with you. Obviously, if there's any name calling or whatever, your stuff might not make it into print. But if we can all be cool with each other, I'd love to hear about your memories of third edition. I'd love to hear your memories about the OSR and all that stuff. What were some of your favorite clones? What were some of your favorite supplements that people did? There's a lot of crazy stuff that was made for the OSR. A lot of cool, crazy stuff. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. And in the meantime, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another. And I will see you next time on Dad's Den of Pop Culture.